Hello, Anthony.
Hello, Claudia.
And hello, Michael Edwards. We want to welcome you as a guest today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Michael is the Vice President for Advocacy and General Counsel for the World Council of Credit Unions, which is www.wocc.org. Michael directs the World Council's Advocacy Department right in Washington, D.C., and that's where we met him. So for 40 years, the WOCC have been advocating internationally to help credit unions and their members. They provide so much education and global networking. They grow and strengthen the credit union system. They offer so much. They offer technical assistance, training and tools for management, outreach, networking. They do so much wonderful work. So I want to thank you for joining us. Now, we met Michael at the hearing to sort of hopefully repeal FATCA.
That's right.
It was so great to meet you there, Michael. You know, we did hear compelling testimony from expats, attorney James Bopp, so many people that want to fight FATCA, and to see someone there representing credit unions was wonderful, you know, because you hear the people part of it, but we also want to know about the foreign and domestic financial impact of FATCA. So what compelled you to go to that hearing?
Well, it was great meeting you there as well, and thank you again for letting me on your show. The FATCA law is something that I've been working on since 2012, since before there was a regulation.
Wow.
I used to work for the Credit Union National Association. And when I joined the World Council of Credit Unions, we represent credit unions around the world. The ones in the United States that are members of the Credit Union National Association are affiliated with us, but we also represent credit unions in Canada and Europe and Australia and South America, Africa, all over the place, Asia. And the foreign credit unions were very unhappy about FATCA, and actually the credit unions in the United States didn't really know that much about it because when it was passed in Congress, there hadn't really been a discussion with the domestic financial institutions in the U.S. because there was an idea it wouldn't apply to them. But actually it does, because anyone who holds money, that's subject to taxation often ends up being a withholding agent. If you're, a company that has employees, you're a withholding agent for their salaries. And FATCA makes credit unions in the United States withholding agents on foreign payments that are initiated by consumers, but not all of them. It's rather complicated. I mean, it basically, if it's a payment going to a foreign institution that's not compliant with FATCA, there's a 30% withholding. But there's circumstances where that doesn't apply. For example, there's in the IRS regulations, it has to do with the source of funds. So if the money being sent is wages, or payment for goods, or lease or rental payments, or gambling winnings, those things are not subject to withholding. But other types of payments are. And so for the U.S. credit unions, it's a big regulatory burden because it's difficult to figure out, well, which payments are subject to withholding. You have to figure out where the money is going to end up, look up that institution, and then determine the source of funds, what type of money is being used. And so a lot of credit unions in the U.S. are not engaged in the international payments market, partially because of FATCA. There's some other legal compliance things like remittance regulations from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that add to the regulatory burdens of domestic credit unions. For the foreign credit unions, in the rulemaking process, actually we were successful in getting a lot of the credit unions outside the U.S. Essentially either exempted from FATCA, because if you're a credit union, usually only local residents can join. There's these requirements called common bond requirements. So it wouldn't be an easy thing to do to use a foreign credit union as a place to hide offshore money, because you probably wouldn't be allowed to join it in the first place. So the IRS was pretty reasonable about that, and so small credit unions and small banks that are below $175 million that are outside the U.S. are exempted from the IRS regulation. And larger ones that only operate in one jurisdiction have to register with the IRS, but they don't have to do the full reporting that larger institutions and internationally active ones have to do. although that's different if that's under the IRS regulation. If your country has an intergovernmental agreement, then usually the small institutions do have to report. So it's a big compliance burden for credit unions inside the U.S. and outside the U.S., but particularly inside the U.S. at this point.
So right now, you guys won because you got exempted from it, but you're still not so thrilled on the international component of the FATCA enforcement.
Right. So there are a number of things that could be better about it. I mean, the domestic credit unions inside the U.S. are not exempted. The foreign credit unions largely are. But FATCA ended up spawning the OECD's Common Reporting Standard, which is like a global version of FATCA. Mm-hmm. Now, the United States has not signed on to that, but in the European Union, they've adopted that as a directive that all member states in the EU have to follow. And so all banks and credit unions in the EU are following this system very similar to FATCA, but with fewer exceptions. I think actually for the U.S. side, credit unions in the U.S., there's a part of the rules that have not been written yet on withholding on gross proceeds, which the IRS keeps delaying. The main FATCA rule, came out in, I guess, the beginning of 2013, has been amended. But the gross proceeds withholding required by the FATCA statute, they haven't written the rules yet. Originally, they delayed it to January 2017, and then they've delayed it to January 2019. And I think that it may be that they're having difficulty figuring out how that would work.
I would
certainly,
say so.
From my perspective, It's difficult to figure out how you would determine the source of the gross proceeds in any type of commercially reasonable way.
And this is a statement I'm going to make, and tell me if you agree with it, because we've seen the implementation of FATCA overseas, but I think in that affects a certain percentage of the U.S. population, and it affects them in a very bad way, but doesn't affect that much of the U.S. persons around the world. I say the worst of FATCA is yet to come, because the worst of FATCA is the domestic foreign withholding agent the foreign withholding rules on who has to withhold the money. You just explained how it's difficult to determine. I've been through the rules myself, and I've talked to other people about when does this really apply. What's the circumstance in which you become a withholding agent that you're not exempted, that you have to apply this 30%. Otherwise, if the IRS comes back to audit you, they can hit you with this 30% penalty. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and actually there was some confusion about who was a withholding agent originally. I read the first proposed rule in 2012, and it occurred to me that, any credit union or bank is going to be a withholding agent under this, plus securities brokers, dealers, and investment companies. But one of my colleagues at the Credit Union National Association called the IRS, and they said, "Oh no, this isn't going to apply to credit unions." And then I had to, we had to show to them, it would actually, because this is the way the law is written, and this is the way the withholding part is. So I completely agree with you. From a financial institution standpoint, the withholding parts are very difficult. Although a number of the larger banks in the United States and elsewhere have invested a lot of money in terms of trying to put up, hire hundreds or thousands of compliance officers just to deal with FATCA. And that's relatively expensive, but since they're so big, it's not that expensive relative to their total balance sheet. It's, the cost of 1,000 compliance officers at a bank like J.P. Morgan Chase is probably a rounding error, where at a credit union or a community bank, it's not like that. Unless you have a huge volume of international wires, you wouldn't be able to support that type of business.
That sort of brings me to my next question is, how many domestic banks and credit unions even know that FATCA exists, because it doesn't really impact them just yet? Do they know what's coming, or they're not even aware this law even exists?
Well, certainly within members of the Credit Union National Association, I think there's a fair amount of knowledge about it, because we've been working on this issue, and we've done compliance summaries and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think that the compliance approach is that, we don't do that many international wires. If we do international wires, well, we have to comply with FATCA, but we also have to comply with the remittance transfer provisions of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Regulation E on electric fund transfers, which is also complicated and expensive, just without going into the details. And so you add those things together, and unless you're doing a really high volume, it's not, you would lose money on an international wire program. So some credit unions that have an international membership, like the ones that serve international organizations like the United Nations, they have to do international wire transfers, and they do a lot. So they can comply with these rules, and I know they've invested resources in terms of doing it, but if you're just a mom and pop community credit union or bank, you might just say we're not going to be in that business anymore.
I think that's sort of the general theme that I saw at the hearing. We had their expert witness, Elise, claim that the big banks were going to profit and that FATCA is intended to sort of bring them to heel. But what I'm hearing from you is that the big banks have the ability to have these compliance officers. It's the little bank that gets hammered and now has to stop doing certain types of business.
Yes, that's correct. And that, I mean, in terms of speaking with people at, the American Bankers Association, they said, well, look, our guys invested in all this stuff. And, it's hard to look at that situation without saying, well, maybe this is giving them a competitive advantage because they're bigger. So it's like that for a lot of different regulations, to be honest. Sometimes the big banks are saying, well, why don't you increase the regulations, but do it in a way that'll make it very expensive because that'll take our competitors out of the market.
I think that's a common issue. That's all around. We see that in the tax industry, that where the big, the entrenched players love regulations because it keeps competition at bay, and that's just the fact of life. And so this just goes to, I think, where this idea that you can be for the little guy and for FATCA simultaneously just isn't true.
Well, not if you're an expatriate American, and not if you're an American financial institution that can't afford hundreds or thousands of compliance officers, because as you know from looking at the regulations, there are a lot of details in this, and the source of funds bit and things like that. It's really hard to do that in an automated way.
Mm-hmm. Trying to understand that the U.S. component is so difficult, but to see where it applies. But this is one area where you at least, do you have to withhold or not withhold? Well, you don't know yet, but this is the query you have to go through, is to say, here, I'm a U.S. business. Now, if you're a U.S. business making a payment to an overseas company, you at least have to run through this entire complicated query to see if you are subject to that 30% withholding. Chances are you're not, but the chances of making an error are so substantial, you have to go through those compliance costs. So again, you're talking, and there's so many small, medium manufacturers who do business around the world. The larger businesses that have the ability to have the economies of scale can keep competition at bay. And I just don't think it's with big banks, but I think it's just with big business as well.
Well, yes, and the penalties for failure to withhold are pretty steep. I mean, the interest charged on it. I mean, it's a percentage on a weekly basis, kind of like loan sharks used to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now we're talking in terms of business, but this also affects U.S. taxpayers living overseas, which we heard at the hearing over and over again. Now, Michael, credit unions are owned by their members. So how is FATCA affecting U.S. taxpayers living overseas?
Well, I think that U.S. taxpayers living overseas have suffered a lot from the confusion of foreign financial institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's several things in the existing rule that should help expats, but I don't think that many of these banks have bothered to go into the details. I mean, for example, the FATCA regulation says that any account, even a new account with a balance below $50,000 or the equivalent of it, and is only recorded at the end of each year, is exempted from the definition of a U.S. account. So in all situations, if you have an account below $50,000, you shouldn't even be worrying about FATCA. But, kind of like we were talking about credit unions saying, well, it's not really worth it to take the chance of noncompliance in this area. A lot of foreign banks have felt the same way. And actually, the IRS rule has a non-discrimination requirement for foreign financial institutions. It says it's illegal for you to discriminate against Americans for being Americans. But that's an American regulation.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Even if they see it, it hasn't really gotten through.
Well, and I think this is a great segue into the so-called compromise offered by the Democrats, that the same country exemption. Well, for so many of the typical expats, they're already exempted. Their accounts are already exempted, yet they're completely frustrated and they're dealing with the amount because the accounts are under $50,000. And so we have this same country exemption that would exempt the reporting of accounts if the taxpayer lives in the same country in which the financial institution is located. So what are your feelings on the same country exemption? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, it's a nice concept, but I'm skeptical whether it would work in practice because the $50,000 account exemption has not, you wouldn't need the same country exemption if the $50,000 or less account exemption worked. Right. And if the part of the IRS regulation saying you're not allowed to discriminate against Americans for being Americans worked, you wouldn't need the same country exemption either. So putting that in the regs would probably have the same effect as these two other provisions that are supposed to address the same issue, which is that they're not sufficient. Now, if you were to go to a credit union, because you're a local resident, you'd have to be a local resident to join the credit union overseas, and you'd be able to point to different things like, well, the account's below $50,000 and I live here, and things like that. The credit union would probably open an account for you because it's not a big institution that's fully automated. It's one where you have real people and you talk to them and you can reason with them, and they're a membership organization and they want to help people, which are eligible to join, which would include you. But if you don't live in an area where that is true, or there's some big banks that would still take your account, but only in big cities. So if you live in a place like Vienna or Geneva or Zurich, you probably can get an account. But if you live out in the hills, out in a rural area, you probably could not.
So you would say that but people who have had their accounts closed overseas could potentially look at a credit union as a place that they would be able to open an account.
Yes. Although there aren't credit unions in every country. I mean, if you're living in the local jurisdiction, you're a local resident. You shouldn't even necessarily really qualify as a U.S. account, but even to the extent you do, if it's below $50,000, there are not, many credit union accounts that are bigger than that. Now, many of the credit unions are too small to offer full service checking accounts. Yeah. But those that do, then that might be a good solution. But, it really depends on where you live.
And I'd say some of them might not be able to offer the full range of financial products necessary. Danny Cattell testified that he was going to lose his mortgage in Switzerland on the forced refinance. So it's possible a credit union wouldn't. The credit unions in the U.S., most of them I think do home financing, but it might not be true elsewhere around the world.
True.
Right, that's correct. So in Switzerland, there aren't credit unions in Switzerland, although there are cooperative banks which are kind of similar. And the cooperative banks may do mortgages, but they wouldn't have any exemptions unless they're below $175 million in assets. Most of the credit unions, say in Europe, mostly do just savings and loans, and mostly consumer unsecured lending. Some do mortgages, but again, there are restrictions on which credit unions you can join. The common bond rules, field of membership, it's also called. And so, you might live in a city where there's a credit union that's big enough to have full service stuff, and then you could join it and solve all your problems. Or you might live in a different town that doesn't have that option.
Are they listed on your website, Michael?
The credit unions, yes. So not the individual credit unions, but our members. If you go to woku.org and look under our members, we have each different member association that's a member of World Council, and if you go to their websites, they have a list of the credit unions that are members of there. So say if you were in the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland, it would be the Irish League of Credit Unions. They're linked on our website, and then if you go to their website, they have an index of all the credit unions in Ireland.
Oh, that's amazing. Now, I want to ask you, at the hearing, we heard from the minority expert witness, which Anthony mentioned, Professor Elise Bean. Was there anything she said in her testimony that you can specifically remember her saying that made you go, wow, good or bad?
Well, it's I think, the professor was in sort of a difficult position in that, they needed to have someone who supports this law. And, from the standpoint of transparency and things like that, it makes sense at a high level. I think the real problem is the practical application of it hurts a lot of people and then creates a lot of compliance costs that are difficult to recoup. So that drives competition out of the international payments market. So that's bad for consumers as well. So it's a well-intentioned law in some respects, but the results, the human costs and the costs on industry are palpable.
Right.
Well, and I do recall that there was this exchange between Mark Meadows and Elise Bean about the support of FATCA within the domestic market. And he asked a question to say, because her position was that this is to get rid of FATCA puts the U.S. domestic market at a competitive disadvantage. And Mark Meadows responded, if I could get an endorsement from the domestic market that would want FATCA repealed, would you agree then that this point is not valid and that we should repeal FATCA? And then she kind of went around and wouldn't answer the question and just said, well, there's really no such thing as a domestic market. Everybody's really international. I don't think it answered the question. You would say there is a domestic credit union market, correct?
Oh, well, certainly, yeah. I mean, credit unions in the U.S. can't accept members who live outside the U.S. unless it's, they're the credit union for the United Nations and you're an employee in the United Nations. So that, actually CUNA and my organization, World Council, wrote a joint letter to Representative Meadows that I believe is on the record of that hearing supporting repeal of FATCA. I think that the bank trade associations have not been on the record on that. Maybe it's because their big banks don't view this as a huge issue at this point, although given that the gross proceeds requirement hasn't been phased in, perhaps they'll change their mind about that.
Well, the issue is that domestic credit unions represent the little guys, and now you're having the domestic people representing the little guys saying we want FATCA gone. They're on record, and I did see that in the news. So I guess, this is sort of spitballing, but what's the hypothetical that leads them to sort of, this is what we noticed, there just doesn't seem that they won't acknowledge the facts. So what do you have any idea why that's going on?
Well, it's sort of, it's a political issue, I think, is part of it. The FATCA statute was part of a jobs bill that was passed by the Democratic Congress. And the main reason it was added was because on paper it should bring in, several $100 million in tax revenue over 10 years, which is not that much. But it was enough to pay for the jobs requirement under the Congress's pay-go rules, pay-as-you-go. Right. So that's why it was put in there kind of at the last minute, because there's a tax gap, and in theory this closes the tax gap. So in theory it'll produce so much money, which in theory will pay for this other initiative. And people were not prepared for the unintended consequences of it. At the time it was passed, there wasn't really a perception this would apply to banks and credit unions in the U.S., but it does.
And just businesses in the U.S.
You own that kind of thing if you're the party that passes it and you want to put a happy face on it.
Yeah, right. And it applies to U.S. businesses too, doing business internationally. Yeah. So they're just, and I don't think few people really understand that if this is implemented, the worst is what to come. comes down to whether or not this will be fully implemented, which sort of begs the question why. How can you have a law where its effect depends on what someone decides to do, if they enforce it or not? And I've heard always this is a good line. The way to get rid of a bad law is to enforce it to the letter.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of misperceptions about how exactly this law works. I mean, at a high level, who's going to be against transparency? But when you get down into the details, it's just it's not really workable.
Yeah. No, it reminds me of talking about pay-go budgeting, the FAST Act that was passed, and we've got this passport revocation to offset the cost of that. That's another whole nother podcast.
The pay-go, the pay-go, it always can be a projection of revenue, and when the revenue fails, there's no accountability. So, I would say, the way to repeal FATCA is say, hey, if we repeal FATCA, we'll make. Just say, well, 800 million this way, 900 million.
$100 billion.
Base it on nothing, and you're fine.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, Michael,
yeah.
You deal with credit unions all over the world, obviously. So during the hearing, I can remember the statement very clearly. It was implied that the rollout of FATCA was, quote, a little bumpy. When you're dealing with credit unions around the world when this rolled out, do you think that's an understatement? How did the credit unions, how did financial institutions around the world react? Was it bumpy? Was it easy? What do they think of it truly?
So it has been a little bumpy.
You're so good at being politically correct, Michael. You're so wonderful.
Yes. Well, it's in many of the cases we've been able to work through it, but there's basically broadly two different types of jurisdictions overseas. They're the ones that have signed an intergovernmental agreement, and they're the ones who have not signed an intergovernmental agreement. And the ones that have not signed, then the IRS regulation applies. Mm-hmm. If you have signed an intergovernmental agreement, then in that jurisdiction, it's really a local rule book that's developed mostly by the local government under that IGA, and the IRS regulation does not apply. So for credit unions in, say, Canada or Australia, the governments there have really wanted to implement FATCA fully and not make any exemptions, and also implement the common reporting standard. And the common reporting standard part has not been phased in fully. But, the credit unions, usually you can't have foreigners join the credit union. So, it's a lot of work for a situation where you're really not going to be able to bank offshore with the credit union in the first place, but you have to do all this compliance work anyway. So in those countries, there's a bit of unhappiness. In the European Union, they've signed all the intergovernmental agreements, or most countries in the EU have signed those, but they also have a European-level directive, I think I mentioned earlier, and so they've kind of have to apply the directive anyway, and they already had inside the EU tax information sharing rule, which this expanded. And then in the other group, the countries that do not have an intergovernmental agreement, in some cases it's been no problems at all. Like the credit unions in Belize, which does not have a intergovernmental agreement, they're all smaller than $175 million in assets, and so they're like, oh, great, we're exempt. And the local banks there agreed with that. Now, in the Republic of Macedonia, in the Balkans, we have one member. It's a credit union that's about 5 million euros in assets, so about $6 million in assets, very small. And they were basically threatened with having their bank accounts closed for not being registered under FATCA, even though they are well below $175 million in assets. And we had to intervene to help make clear to the local bank there that the credit union did not need to register under FATCA, and they were able to keep their accounts. But there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding out there.
Wow. All right. Well, I want to say thank you, Michael, for all the work you do around the world with these credit unions. You know, the whole organization does some really fantastic things. People can get more information on woccu.org.
Woku.
Woku.
I was right.
You were.
I was right. I thought it's like that's probably how they say it.
It is.
It is Woku.
So great information there. If people have questions, they can contact us 888-727-8796 or info@irsmedic.com. It's been so wonderful to get, you know, we've heard the perspective on how this is affecting people, but also, you know, to get your perspective on how it's affecting the financial institutions around the world.
And the smaller institutions too.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your perspective, because it's been really enlightening.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been great.
Anytime, Michael. All right. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can get more awesome FATCA and tax updates.